Now here, if we could be permitted to assume this concentralization exactly represented by the force of the tendency to the center, if the one was exactly proportional to the other, and that the two proceeded together, we should have shown all that is required. The sole difficulty existing then is to establish a direct proportion between, quote, concentralization and the force of concentralization, and this is done, of course, if we establish such proportion between irradiation and the force of irradiation. A very slight inspection of the heavens assures us that the stars have a certain general uniformity, equability, or equidistance of distribution through that region of space in which, collectively, in a roughly globular form, they are situated. This species of very general, rather than absolute, equability being in full keeping with my deduction of inequidistance within certain limits among the originally diffused atoms. As a corollary from the evident design of infinite complexity of relation out of irrelation, I started, it will be remembered, with the idea of the generally uniform but particularly ununiform distribution of the atoms, an idea, I repeat, which is an inspection of the stars as they exist, confirms. But even the merely general equability of distribution, as regards the atoms, there appears a difficulty which no doubt has already suggested itself to those among my readers who have borne it in mind that I suppose this equability of distribution affected through irradiation from a center. The very first glance of the idea, irradiation, forces us to the entertainment of the hitherto unseparated and seemingly inseparable idea of agglomeration about a center. With dispersion as we recede from it, the idea, in a word, of inequability of distribution in respect to the matter irradiated. Now, I have elsewhere observed that it is by just such difficulties as the one now in question, such roughnesses, such peculiarities, such protuberances are above the plane of the ordinary, that reason feels her way, if at all, in her search for the true. By the difficulty of the quote-unquote peculiarity now presented, I leap at once to the secret. A secret which I might never have attained but for the peculiarity and the inferences which, in its mere character of peculiarity, it affords me. The process of thought at this point may be thus roughly sketched. I say to myself, unity, as I have explained it, is a truth. I feel it. Diffusion is a truth. I see it. Irradiation, by which alone these two truths are reconciled, is a consequent truth. I perceive it. Equability of diffusion, first deduced a priori and then corroborated by the inspection of phenomena, is also a truth. I fully admit it. So far, all is clear around me. There are no clouds behind which the secret, the great secret of the gravitating modus operandi, can possibly lie hidden. But this secret lies hereabouts. Most assuredly, and were there but a cloud in view, I should be driven to the suspicion of that cloud. Unquote. And now, just as I say this, there actually comes a cloud. Into view. This cloud is the seeming impossibility of reconciling my truth, irradiation with my truth, equability of diffusion, I say now, quote, behind this seeming impossibility is to be found what I desire. I do not say, quote unquote, real impossibility, for invincible faith in my truths assures me that it is a mere difficulty after all. But I go on to say with unflinching confidence that when this difficulty shall be solved, we shall find, wrapped up in the process of solution, the key to the secret at which we aim. Moreover, I feel that we shall discover but one possible solution to the difficulty. This for the reason that were there two, one would be superioratory, would be fruitless, would be empty, would contain no key, since no duplicate key can be needed to any secret of nature. And now let us see our usual notions of irradiation. In fact, all our distant notions of it are caught merely from the processes we see exemplified in light. Here, there is a continuous outpouring of the ray streams, and with a force with which we have at least no right to suppose varies at all. Now, in any such irradiation as this, continuous and of unvarying force, the regions nearer the center must inevitably be always more crowded and with the irradiated matter than the regions more remote. But I have assumed no such irradiation as this. I assume no continuous irradiation, and for the simple reason that such an assumption would have involved, first, the necessity of entertaining a conception which I have shown no man can entertain, and which, as I will more fully explain hereafter, all observation of the firmament refutes. The conception of the absolute infinity of the universe of stars, and would have involved, secondly, the impossibility of understanding the reaction, that is, gravitation, as existing now, since, while an act is continual, no reaction, of course, can take place. My assumption then, or rather my inevitable deduction from just premises, was that of a determinate in radiation, one finally discontinued. Let me now describe the sole possible mode in which it is conceivable that matter could have been diffused through space, so as to fulfill the conditions at once of irradiation and of generally equable distribution. For convenience of an illustration, let us imagine in the first place a hollow sphere of glass or of anything else, occupying the space throughout which the universal matter is to be thus equally diffused. By means of irradiation from the absolute, irrelative, unconditional particle placed in the center of the sphere. Now, a certain exertion of the diffusive power, presumed to be the divine volition, in other words, a certain force whose measure is the quantity of the matter, that is to say, the number of atoms emits by irradiation, this certain number of atoms, forcing them in all directions outwardly from the center, their proximity to each other diminishing as they proceed, until finally they are distributed loosely over the interior surface of the sphere. When these atoms have attained this position, or while proceeding to attain it, a second and inferior exercise of the same force, or a second and inferior force of the same character, emits in the same manner, that is to say, by radiation, as before, a second stratum of atoms, which proceeds till it deposit itself upon the first. The number of atoms in this case is in the former being, of course, the measure of the force which emitted them, in other words, the force being precisely adapted to the purpose it effects. The force and the number of atoms sent out by the force being directly proportional. When this second stratum has reached the destined position, or while approaching it, a third still inferior exertion of the force, or a third inferior force of a similar character, the number of atoms emitted being in all cases the measure of the force, proceeds to deposit a third stratum upon the second, and so on until these concentric strata, growing gradually less and less, come down at length to the central point, and the diffusive matter simultaneously with the diffusive force is exhausted. We have now the sphere filled, through means of irradiation, with atoms equally diffused. The two necessary conditions, those of irradiation and of equable diffusion, are satisfied, and by the sole process in which the possibility of their simultaneous satisfaction is conceivable. For this reason, I confidently expect to find, lurking in the present condition of the atoms as distributed through the sphere, the secret of which I am in search, the all-important principle of the modus operandi of the Newtonian law. Let us examine, then, the actual condition of the atoms. They lie in a series of concentric strata. They are equally diffused through the atmosphere. They have been irradiated by these states. The atoms, being equally distributed, the greater the superficial extent of any of these concentric strata or spheres, the more atoms will lie upon it. In other words, the number of atoms lying upon the surface of any of the concentric spheres is directly proportional with the extent of that surface. But in any of the series of concentric spheres, the surfaces are directly proportional with the squares of those distances from the center. Therefore, the number of atoms in any stratum is directly proportional with the square of that stratum's distance from the center. But the number of atoms in any stratum is the measure of the force which emitted that stratum. That is to say, it's directly proportional with the force. Therefore, the force which irradiated any stratum is directly proportional with the square of that stratum's distance from the center, or generally the force of that irradiation has been directly proportional with the squares of the distances. Now, reaction, as far as we know anything of it, action conversed. The general principle of gravity being, in the first place, understood as the reaction of an act, as the expression of an act, desire on the part of matter, while existing in the state of diffusion, to return into the unity once it was diffused, and in the second place, the mind being called upon to determine the character of desire, the matter in which it would naturally be manifested. In other words, being called upon to conceive a probable law or modus operandi for the return, could not well help arriving at the conclusion that this law of return would be precisely converse with the law of departure. That such would be the case, anyone at least would be abundantly justified in taking for granted, in such time as some person should suggest something like a plausible reason why it should not be the case, until such period as a law of return shall be imagined which the intellect can consider as preferable. Matter, then, irradiated in space with a force varying as the squares of the distances, it might, a priori, be supposed to return toward its center of irradiation with a force varying inversely as the squares of the distances. As I've already shown in any principle which will explain why the atoms should tend, according to any law, to the general center, must be admitted as satisfactorily explaining at the same time why, according to the same law, they should tend each to each. For, in fact, the tendency of the general center is not to centers as such, but because of its being a point in tending towards which each atom tends most directly to its real and essential center, unity. the absolute and final union of all. The consideration here involves presence to my mind, to my own mind, no embarrassment whatever. But this fact does not blind me to the possibility of its being obscure to those who have been less in the habit of dealing with abstractions, and upon the whole, it may be as well to look at the matter from one or two other points of view. The absolute, a relative particle primarily created by the volition of God, must have been in a condition of positively normality or rightfulness. For wrongfulness implies relation. Right is positive, wrong is negative. It is merely the negation of right, as cold is the negation of heat, darkness of light. That a thing may be wrong, it is necessary that there may be some other thing in relation to which it is wrong. Some condition which it fails to satisfy, some law which it violates, some being whom it aggrieves. If there be no such being, law, or condition, in respect to the thing when it is wrong, to which the thing is wrong, and still more especially if no beings, laws, or conditions exist at all, then the thing cannot be wrong and consequently must be right. Any deviation from normality arises at it involves a tendency to return to it. A difference from the normal, from the right, from the just, can be understood as affected only by the overcoming a difficulty. And if the force which overcomes the difficulty be not infinitely continued, the ineradicable tendency to return will at length be permitted to act toward its own satisfaction. Upon withdrawal of the force, the tendency acts. This is the principle of reaction as the inevitable consequence of finite action. Employing a phraseology of which the seeming affectation will be pardoned for its expressiveness, we may say that reaction is the return from the condition as it is, and ought not to be into the condition of as it was originally, and therefore ought to be. And let me add here that the absolute force of reaction wouldn't be, no doubt, always found in direct proportion with the reality, the truth, the absoluteness of the originality, if ever it were possible to measure this latter. And consequently, the greatest of all conceivable reactions must be produced by the tendency which we now discuss. The tendency to return to the absolute original into the supremely primitive. Gravity, then, must be the strongest of forces. An idea reached a priori and abundantly confirmed by induction. What use I make of this idea will be seen in the sequel. The atoms, now, having been diffused from the normal condition of unity, seek to return to what? Not to any particular point, certainly, for it is clear that if upon the diffusion the whole universe of matter had been projected collectively to a distance from the point of irradiation, the atomic tendency to the general center of the sphere would not have been disturbed in the least. The atoms would not have sought the point of any absolute space from which they were originally impelled. It is merely the condition and not the point or locality at which this condition took its rise that these atoms seek to reestablish. It is merely that the condition which there is their normality that they desire. But they seek a center, it will be said, and the center is a point. True. But they seek at this point, not in its character or point, for where the whole sphere moved from its position, they would seek equally the center, and the center there will be a new point. But because it so happens, on account of the form at which they collectively exist, that of the sphere, that only through the point in question, the sphere center, they can attain their true object, unity. In the direction of the center, each atom perceives more atoms than in any other direction. Each atom is impelled towards the center because along the straight line joining it and the center passing onto the circumference beyond, there lies a greater number of atoms than along any other straight line. A greater number of objects seek it. The individual atom, a greater number of tendencies to unity, a greater number of satisfactions to its own tendency to unity. In a word, because in the direction of the center lies the utmost possibility of satisfaction, generally for its own individual appetite. To be brief, the condition, unity, is all that is really sought. And if the atoms seem to seek the center of the sphere, it is only impliedly, through implication, because such center happens to imply, to include, or to involve the only essential center, unity. But on account of this implication or involution, there is no possibility of practically separating the tendency to unity in the abstract from the tendency to the concrete center. Thus, the tendency of the atoms to the general center is, to all practical intents and for all logical purposes, the tendency each to its each. And the tendency to each, it's the tendency of the center. And the one tendency may be assumed as the other. Whatever will apply to the one must be thoroughly applicable to the other. And in conclusion, whatever principle will satisfactorily explain the one cannot be questioned as an explanation of the other. In looking carefully around me for a rational objection to what I advanced, I am able to discover nothing but of that class of objections usually urged by the double doubters for doubt's sake. I very readily perceive three, and proceed to dispose of them in order. It may be said first, the proof of the force of the radiation in the case described is directly proportional to the squares of the distances. Depends upon an unwarranted assumption, that of the number of atoms in each stratum being the measure of the force with which they are emitted. I reply not only that I am warranted in such assumption, but that I should be utterly unwarranted in any other. What I assume is simply that an effect is the measure of the cause. That every exercise of the divine will be proportional to that which it demands the exertion, that the means of omnipotence or omniscience will be exactly adapted to its purposes. Neither can a deficiency nor an excess of cause bring to pass any effect. Had the force which irradiated any stratum to its position been either more or less than was needed for the purpose, that is to say, not directly proportional to the purpose, then to its position that stratum could not have been irradiated. Had the force with which with a view to general equability to distribution emitted this proper number of atoms for each stratum been not directly proportional to the number, then the number would not have been the number demanded for the equable distribution. The second supposable objection is somewhat better entitled to an answer. It is an admitted principle in dynamics that every body, or receiving an impulse, or disposition to move, will move onward in a straight line, in the direction imparted by the impelling force, until deflected or stopped by some other force. How then, it may be asked, is my first or external stratum of atoms to be understood as discontinuing their movement at the circumference of the imaginary glass sphere, when no other second force of more of the imaginary character appears to account for the discontinuance? I reply that the objection in this case actually does arise out of, quote, an unwarranted assumption, unquote, on the part of the objector. The assumption that of a principle in dynamics at an epoch when no quote-unquote principles in anything exist. I use the word principle, of course, in the objector's understanding of the word. In the beginning, we can admit, indeed we can comprehend, the one first cause, the truly ultimate principle, the volition of God. The primary act, that of the irradiation from unity, must have been independent of all that which the world now calls principle, because all that we so designate is but a consequence of the reaction of that primary act. I say primary act, for the creation of the absolute material particle is more than properly to be regarded as a conception than as an act of the ordinary meaning of the term. Thus, we must regard the primary act as an act for the establishment of what we can now call principles. But this primary act itself is to be considered as continuous volition. The thought of God is to be understood as originating the diffusion, as proceeding with it, as regulating it, and finally as being withdrawn from it upon its completion. Thence commences reaction, and through reaction, principle, as we employ the word. It will be advisable, however, to limit the application of this word to the two immediate results of the discontinuance of the divine volition. That is, to the two agents, attraction and repulsion. Every other natural agent depends, either more or less immediately, upon these two, and therefore it will be more conveniently designated as sub-principle. It may be objected, thirdly, that, in general, the peculiar mode of distribution which I have suggested for the atoms is, quote, an hypothesis and nothing more, unquote. Now, I am aware that the word hypothesis is a ponderous sledgehammer, grasped immediately, if not lifted, by the very diminutive thinkers. Upon the first appearance of any proposition wearing in any particular the garb of theory, but, quote, hypothesis, unquote, cannot be wielded here for any good purpose, even by those who succeed in lifting it, little men or great. I maintain first that only in the mode described as it conceivable that matter could have been diffused so as to fulfill at once the conditions of irradiation and of generally equable distribution. I maintain, secondly, that these conditions themselves have been imposed upon me as necessities in a train of ratiocination as rigorously logical as that which establishes any demonstration in Euclid. And I maintain, thirdly, that even if the charge of hypothesis were as fully sustained as it is, in fact, unsustained and untenable, still the validity and indisputability of my result would not, even in the slightest particular, be disturbed. To explain the Newtonian gravity, a law of nature, a law whose existence as such no one out of Bethlehem questions. A law whose admission as such enables us to account for 9/10 of the universal phenomena. A law which merely because it does so enable us to account for these phenomena, we are perfectly willing, without reference to any other considerations, to admit. It cannot help admitting as a law, nevertheless, of which neither the principle nor the modus operandi of the principle has ever yet been traced by the human analysis. A law, in short, which neither in its detail nor in its generality has been found susceptible of explanation at all, is at length seen to be at every point thoroughly explicable, provided only that we yield to our assent to what? To an hypothesis? Why, if the merest hypothesis, if in hypothesis for whose assumption, as in the case of that pure hypothesis, the Newtonian law itself, no shadow of a priori reason could be assigned if in hypothesis, even so absolute as all this implies, would enable us to perceive a principle for the Newtonian law, would enable us to understand as satisfied conditions so miraculously, so ineffably complex and seemingly irreconcilable as those involved in the relations of which gravity tells us. What rational being could so expose his fatuity as to call even this absolute hypothesis an hypothesis any longer, unless indeed he were to persist in so calling it, with the understanding that he did so simply for the sake of consistency in words? But what is the true case of the state of our present case? What is the fact? Not only is it not a hypothesis which we are required to adopt, in order to admit the principle at issue is explained, but that it is a logical conclusion which we are requested not to adopt if we can avoid it, which we are simply invited to deny if we can. A conclusion of so accurate logicality that to dispute it would be the effort. To doubt its validity beyond our power. A conclusion from which we see no mode of escape. Turn as we will, a result which confronts us either at the end of an inductive journey from the phenomena of the very law discussed, or at the close of a deductive career from the most rigorously simple of all conceivable assumptions. The assumption, in a word, of simplicity itself.